Howdy folks, Arizona springtime here, memoir of a journey. We're in the final chapter. It'll be divided into two parts. This is part 1. Chapter 17 on artists and authors at the canyon. Another creative path to express access to the canyon is through artistic photographs. I know that was my original intent during the 3 springtime visits to the canyon. Only a part of my experiences were recorded. The resultant images are my expression of a mere moment of time for the canyon, yet those moments become timeless as an image. What makes a photograph a springtime photograph of the canyon? Spring is one of the tougher seasons to forensically identify in a photograph due to the nature of the canyon. Higher elevations, such as along the rim or plateau, may still exhibit winter weather like we had encountered 2 of the 3 times we were there. At the south rim, springtime may look wintry, not only because of the higher elevation, but most of the surrounding area is situated on a high plateau. On the Navajo Dene Reservation, there is winter-like weather into late March and April. It's the same for Flagstaff. Some of those photographs may appear to viewers as reminiscent of winter scenery. During our hike far below the rim, we encountered numerous spring flowers bursting forth. Therefore, one way to know if an image is taken in spring at the canyon is the appearance of wildflowers on display below the rim. Those floral displays appear by late March, the same time of year as lower elevations such as the Phoenix area. Photographs taken in the more elevated north rim may not have wildflower displays until deep into April or May. At that time, a wide variety of wildflowers will explode in colors of yellows, whites, blues, pinks, reds, and purples. Wildflower bloom suggests the arrival of other indicators of spring, including pollinators such as butterflies. Butterflies are only one type of the flying insects that will give you an idea that it's spring. Photographs, including some migrating birds, could also be an indicator of springtime. Another approach to identifying spring photographs is observing particularities of an image. Autumn photographs will display reds and yellows of fall foliage. During summer, the sun is nearly overhead, and photographs with shallow shadows can reveal the season. Many wintertime photographs show snow extending lower into the canyon, covering the prominences, cliff faces, and eroded sides. Who was the first photographer to record views of the canyon? During George Wheeler's expedition of 1871 to record American lands west of the 100th meridian, he employed photographer Timothy O'Sullivan. During this era of the wet plate, the photographer sometimes had just minutes after applying the liquid light-sensitive emulsion to large glass plates to expose the image in a view camera and then enter a blackened tint to develop the plate before it dried. Some historians are unimpressed by the challenges the pioneer Western photographers encountered. They argued that all photographers during the era were used to the constraints of the wet plate. I argue the arid West significantly reduced the time needed between exposure and fixing the image to the glass plate as compared to areas of the country that had higher humidity. O'Sullivan was the first to photograph the canyon, and he was an enigma among the early photographers. Most of the photographers out west followed a standardized set of compositional rules typical of early documentary style photography. This style incorporated a human figure or a prop to give the viewer a scale of the landscape or scene. Sometimes the figures were placed in the scene and were obvious, and sometimes they were well hidden in the photograph. In contrast, O'Sullivan often composed scenes with no evident compositional framing, with the resultant images expressing an increased dramatic effect. In some images, O'Sullivan would tilt the camera to artistically emphasize the landscape. O'Sullivan's pictures were not scenic in the classic art sense, but provided a level of dramatic authenticity for an emerging art form. He had a singular vision. He wanted to express to viewers about the wonders throughout the West, including the Grand Canyon. Another of the early photographers at the canyon was Jack Hilliers, a former boatsman oarsman. He was the second replacement after two other photographers quit John Wesley Powell's second expedition through the Grand Canyon. Hilliers' body of work would eventually build to an archive of more than 20,000 negatives, many taken in the Southwest. His images of the canyon caught the public's imagination. His dry plate era images didn't have the time constraints as the wet plates. The bulky glass plates could be loaded into a view camera, the photograph composed and developed into a negative with much less of a burden. Composition and fine adjustments to the large format cameras freed a growing population of photographers to focus on artistic effects. In 1872, William Bell took over for O'Sullivan's expedition. He practiced a more traditional documentarian style of photography. For example, his photograph with the descriptive title, quote, "Looking north across the canyon from a point on the east side of the three castles," end quote, now identified as Vishnu Quadrangle, is a typical document of the canyon. The image includes a man casually lounging near the edge of a cliff. In the background, the great visual depth and panoramic scope of the Grand Canyon is realized. The goal of most expedition photographers was to transform an alien land that was in front of them into something that Americans could appreciate as a natural American landscape. Joel Snyder, in his book, One, Many, maintains that O'Sullivan and Bell were hired by scientific expeditions not as scientists but as photographers. People such as Wheeler and Powell used the images to show the value of the expedition to legislators in Washington, D.C. They hoped to prove the importance of the Great Western Expeditions. They needed money appropriated by Congress. The value of those expeditions had to be visually interesting beyond their record of scientific books, maps, and drawings. They hoped the photographs provided a direct record and translate into greater appropriations. Beyond the money, expedition leaders such as George Wheeler would benefit from the exposure, so to speak, gained by the output of scientific as well as photographic proof that the expeditions were worth the money. Later, after the Western expeditions ended, independent pioneer photographers arrived at the canyon to expand their sales of stereo images, viewed through a stereoscope. The new era of photography at the canyon began in 1903 when Emery and Ellsworth, the Cole brothers, opened for business. The commercial venture, had a rough beginning. It was not easy to set up a studio at the canyon. The Fred Harvey Company owned virtually everything along the South Rim, and the monopoly refused to cooperate with the brothers. The stubborn brothers would find a way to outsmart the monopoly. They made an agreement with company rival Ralph Cameron. He had a mining claim along and near the South Rim. After first erecting a tent studio, the brothers expanded to the very edge of the rim and built a permanent studio. The brothers originally sold photographs of expeditions that were heading down into the canyon via muleback. After they discovered that commercial work was too limited and could never cover their expenses, they began to photograph parts of the canyon that were inaccessible to tourists. Those were the photographs the tourists wanted. The brothers revised their business model and became early scenic commercial art photographers. Their familiar style of photography may have originated in landscape photographs destined to become stereo photographs. The stereo style required a foreground to frame and give depth to a wide open landscape. Typical of that style is a classic image the brothers recorded taken at the Colorado River. In the foreground are large boulders and rocks. In the middle ground is a cliff face towering up out of the deep gorge. In the background there is a distant cliff face rising up to the top of the image with a small piece of sky seen beyond that. Colorado River at the bottom of the image has the old document style to express the great scale as the tiny figure of Ellsworth Kolb is seen standing on rocks near midstream. Their drive to record previously unknown parts of the canyon overcame any fear in an otherwise dangerous environment. The brothers took their heavy wooden view cameras, a 5x7 and 8x10 Seneca, into steep and claustrophobic crevices, and then balanced the cameras on large wooden tripods. For smaller images, they brought along a stereo camera, carried a handheld Kodak bellows camera that used the newer roll film. In America, the brothers became well known for their daring adventures in the canyon. One adventure resulted in the first motion picture of a boat traveling along the length of the Colorado River. At one point, Ellsworth was thrown into the river and was drowning, while Emery recorded the scene with his motion picture camera. He then put down the camera and ran to save his brother. The resulting movie was shown for over 60 years at their Grand Canyon Cliffside studio. Another adventurous exploration in the canyon centered on Shiva Temple, a landmark in the canyon. The vast mesa was believed to be completely isolated from all other land for the past 35,000 years. The American Museum of Natural History decided to take a scientific expedition in search of new species that may have evolved separately on the isolated mesa. Emery Cold offered to be a guide but was summarily refused. He decided to form his own expedition ahead of the official one. Later, as the scientific expedition completed their trek to the mesa, the official scientists found 3 empty tomato cans and a couple of Kodak film boxes. Emery had left those purposely behind as a rebuff to his rejection as guide. As a further insult to the official expedition, no new species were found because a thin land bridge between Shiva Temple and the canyon, discovered by Emery, meant the mesa was not as isolated as believed. Photography continued to evolve as an art form. One of the self-described craftsmen, Ansel Adams, became the first of the modern scenic fine art photographers. He worked with a large format camera throughout his entire career as an art photographer. He began as a proponent of the popular pictorialist style of photography. The style used soft focus and various techniques to create an impressionistic image, more art-like than photographic. The technique was heralded by Alfred Stieglitz, who was the singular driving force out to prove to the art world that photography was a new medium for art production. One of Stieglitz's contemporaries was Alvin Langdon Coburn. He photographed the canyon in the pictorial style in 1911. His photographs there are slightly out of focus and give edges of the canyon a wispy look. The contrast is low, and there are few tones in the photographs. Ansel Adams later rejected the pictorialist style and evolved to what would be later named straight photography. That style saw the image or scene as unique in itself, and there was comparatively little manipulation of the final image. That is not to say he did not use techniques to refine the final image into his vision. He used what was considered non-invasive techniques, such as dodging and burning, or lightening or darkening specific areas of the paper photograph. Adams was hired by the National Park Service in 1941 to complete a large mural for the Department of Interior building in Washington, D.C. He began to photograph various national parks, but the project was never completed due to America's entrance into World War II. Yet, he did complete a series of photographs of the Grand Canyon. Some of his canyon photographs depict depth by using a receding horizon and increasing haze that models the distant landscape. His photographs remind me of Timothy O'Sullivan's photographs and the straightforward style. Unlike O'Sullivan, who had limitations on using types of film and control over exposure, Adams was a master of light composition and shadow. During his long career, he perfected a style emphasizing a composition in high contrast, marked with stark, nearly black skies. He used a red or orange filter, and white clouds exquisite in detail and depth. Adams relied solely on nature to provide all the interest anyone needed, and his photographs are interesting from top to bottom and side to side. He did not need to incorporate framing to depict depth. Instead, he concentrated his expertise on a proper exposure. Often he exposed the film to emphasize highlights. As a result, shadows and darkened areas in his photographs become areas of interest for a viewer. Even the deepest shadows provide a mystery for the viewer to explore. To this day, his photographs resonate with a singular style. His popularity is maintained to this day for practitioners of black and white photography. The first of the color photographers to practice a modern scenic art style was also the first true master of color photography, Elliott Porter. Porter also exposed film to emphasize the highlights in a scene. His reflect his lack of fear of shadows and dark areas. A viewer's imagination could explore those more mysterious parts of the photograph. Unlike many landscape photographers, Porter had used macro or close-up photography to express himself. The abstract forms of nature, whether leaves, rocks, or small streams of flowing water, were mastered by Porter, all in full color. Joseph Munch was among the first of the commercial color photographers to practice the early style of photography that used framing. His images often used a foreground that added a sense of depth. Photographs included elements such as rock formations or trees tastefully arranged in the foreground. Munch began photographing the Grand Canyon during the late 1930s. He was a practitioner of large format photography, using a 4x5 Linhof camera to record images on large sheets of Ektachrome slide film, images that were transparent positives. Ray Manley, as well as Munch, photographed for Arizona Highways, a magazine founded to promote Arizona as a destination. The magazine helped to popularize Arizona and its star attraction, the Grand Canyon, with their early full-color issues. Manley was especially adept at using foreground framing in his artistic style, not beyond using the old documentary technique of having people in the background to add scale. Those photographs meant tiny figures were placed in vast landscapes. He also worked with large format cameras. Those cameras have an advantage over smaller format cameras for a couple of reasons. One advantage is the large film size allows for photographs to remain sharp without loss of precise detail, even if enlarged. Another advantage is obvious in images of cliffs or mountains. The camera lens can be uniquely positioned to eliminate parallax, the appearance that a tall vertical object is falling backward. More recently, photographer John Running added a human side to the oeuvre of the canyon by taking portraits and thereby making popular the Canyon River Runners. He frequented the canyon from his nearby studio in Flagstaff, Arizona. Art photographer Mark Klett challenged himself to track down the exact same locations that historic photographs were taken and then re-photograph them. He found and re-photographed locations used by pioneer photographers such as William Henry Jackson and Timothy O'Sullivan. He followed the paths of the great early southwestern scientific expeditions. Although countless photographs have been taken at the Grand Canyon, including snapshots, selfies, artistic, and commercial, those images record a moment in time, but they never grasp away the soul of the canyon. For me, the best of these images are a one-way conversation by the photographer expressing their experience at the canyon. So ends part 1 of this chapter. We'll see you for the next and final part of the book.